My name is Veronica Chapman-Smith. I'm the Vice President of Community Initiatives at Opera Philadelphia. I want to thank you for joining us for today's lecture, which is part of Opera Philadelphia's collaboration with the International Florence Prize Festival, which is affectionately called Price Fest. Today's lecture, Voice Teachers of the 20th Century in African American Communities, explores the work of African American teachers and the students of opera in cities from Philadelphia to Chicago to New York. As I mentioned, this event is a collaboration with Price Fest. And for those who are not familiar with the amazing work of Price Fest, the mission of the organization is to celebrate the life and legacy of composer Florence Beatrice Price through an annual festival, which includes performances of her music, scholarly and educational presentations, and advocacy-oriented events. Additionally, Price Fest has created a Price Pledge initiative designed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in classical music, programming, and instruction, beginning from middle school, going all the way through college level. I would now like to introduce Dr. Lucy Kaplan. Dr. Kaplan is an interdisciplinary scholar of music and culture in the United States. She is the author of the new book, Dreaming in Ensemble, How Black Artists Transformed American Opera, which is published by Harvard University Press. She is an assistant professor of music at Worcester Polytech Institute, where she teaches a wide range of classes on American music, African American music, and cultural history. I am now going to pass the baton over to Dr. Kaplan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Veronica, for the lovely introduction and also for all the work that you've done to help arrange this talk. I also wanted to thank Claire Frisbee at Opera Philadelphia and Doug Shadle of Price Fest for their really generous invitation to be here and to share my work with you all today. My talk today, I would like to begin with a brief story. One summer evening in July of 1925, dozens of young African-American women filed through the doors of the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which you can see here, and then they descended a staircase to the basement level. One by one, they entered a subterranean auditorium where a panel of judges waited to hear them sing. And these women were entrants in a contest organized by an Italian tenor, Edoardo Ferrari Fontana, that was aimed at Black sopranos who, quote, hoped to train for a musical career in grand opera. The announcement for this contest noted that one of the ambitions of Mr. Fontana's life is to hear the opera Aida sung in the noted Metropolitan Opera House with the Black soprano in the leading role. There were 3 different nights of auditions, and the judges eventually heard more than 250 singers. 24 finalists, whose pictures you can see here, appeared at a public recital, and then 2 winners were chosen. One, a woman named Marguerite Avery, another, a woman named Jessie Zachary. And Fontana told the crowd, I feel absolutely certain that before long, you will hear some of the singers you have listened to tonight conquering huge audiences on the operatic stage. I promise you that I will do all within my power to bring this about. But that wasn't quite true. Fontana never made good on this promise. Neither of these winners went on to have a career in opera, and this contest and most of its entrants kind of faded into obscurity. So some things about this contest might seem surprising. We don't typically, I think, often think of Black women in the 1920s United States as aspiring opera singers. Thinking of that cultural world, we might more often imagine places like the cabarets and jazz clubs featured on this 1932 image of a nightclub map of Harlem. And when we're thinking about opera in the US during that period, we might imagine the old Met seen here, and this kind of grand, imposing venue that hosted more than 3,000 people with this quite ornate design and mostly European artists. So where did these women in this contest fit in? The fact that hundreds of people entered in the first place, I think offers really compelling evidence of widespread interest in opera among African Americans of the time and of a collective investment in the art form's possibilities, as a place of social recognition and artistic achievement. The singer Marguerite Avery, one of the contest winners, said, "I was determined to sing my best. I made up my mind to go someplace where I could get my voice trained. I wanted to sing." Yet these hopeful aspirations coexisted sort of uneasily with the art form's Eurocentric history and the racist ideologies and practices of major US operatic institutions. I think the unfulfilled promise at the heart of this contest sort of exemplifies that tension. On the one hand, it offered the participants this opportunity to ascend to stardom, singing Aida at the Met, but it also limited their horizons by suggesting that that should be their only or most ambitious goal. We might also note that the Met did not actually engage a Black singer in a significant role until Marian Anderson's debut 30 years later in 1955. And I'll just pause here to note that today, February 27th, is Marian Anderson's birthday, so it feels very special to be giving this talk on this particular occasion. We might also think back to the place where this contest did take place, a library basement. Rather than standing on a big stage at the Met, these singers were literally hidden from sight. But this particular library has a very interesting history. Just a few months before the contest, a vast collection of Black literary and cultural materials, the precursor to what's known today as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, had opened just a few floors above where this contest was taking place. So I like to imagine that we might hear these women's voices resounding up from the basement auditorium through this archive and kind of weaving themselves with the broader landscape of African-American history. In that sense, maybe they weren't so hidden after all. One thing to note too about these women is that they were all amateurs, students of opera who must have spent hours upon hours before the contest practicing their arias, rehearsing with pianists, learning their music. And as such, they offer us a pathway into thinking a bit differently about the history of opera in America and among African-American artists in particular. I think our narratives around opera history often focus on superstars like Marian Anderson, who've endured as kind of singular figures within our collective imagination. But I'm interested in what we might learn if we look elsewhere. What was it like to be Jessie Zachary, choosing an aria to sing for this contest? To be Marguerite Avery, moving to Harlem so that she could take voice lessons? To be a pianist for the competition, spending hours in that auditorium listening to these women's voices? What might we learn about opera's history if we center those kinds of experiences? So those are the kinds of questions that I plan to take us through in my talk today. I'll be sharing the stories of two cases in particular. The first is the marvelous early 20th century soprano Antoinette Garnes, and the second is the students and teachers of Chicago's Southside School of Grand Opera. And my hope is that these examples will really expand our ideas of what histories of opera are important to tell. Few of these figures, it should be noted, went on to become known as opera singers per se. It was one part of their rich and varied creative lives. But I think that by paying attention to these institutions and contexts in which these singers flourished, we can think about opera as something other than an endpoint to which these artists aspired. Rather, it was something that was meaningful to them every day as part of their lives. The everyday making of opera was meaningful in its own right. So my talk today is based on my new book, which is called Dreaming in Ensemble: How Black Artists Transformed American Opera. And this book tells the story of a wide range of singers, composers, music critics, voice teachers, audience members, and students who engaged with opera during the years from about 1893 through 1955. It tells how these artists created a culture of operatic music making that flourished even as they were excluded often from the art form's most prominent institutions. Across the fields of performance and composition and criticism and pedagogy, African-American artists engaged with opera in really kaleidoscopically varied ways. And their goals were much more than simply inclusion, literal and figurative, in the existing opera house. They thought of opera as a collective cultural practice under Jim Crow, an endeavor that powerfully expanded their opportunities for self-making and world-making. And I argue in my book that this was a really fundamentally transformative endeavor, both for the individuals who took part in it and also for the contributions it made to Black culture, to opera, and to the landscape of American culture writ large. To understand how significant this is, it's important to take a little bit of a step back in time. Long before the 1925 contests that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we can trace a much longer and quite fraught history between African-American history and the history of opera. The first known performance of an opera in North America took place in Charleston, South Carolina, also the place that was the capital of the US slave trade. A more immediate relationship emerged in the context of blackface minstrelsy, one of the most notorious elements of American cultural history. The white performer T.D. Rice, who was one of the founders of this genre, often called his minstrel shows Ethiopian operas and called the venues in which they were performed Ethiopian opera houses. Parodies of arias were a frequent occurrence at these shows. Yet, despite these inauspicious beginnings, in the mid-1800s, a generation of Black singers, mostly women, rose to fame for their talents in the realm of operatic singing. We see a few of them here. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield was known as the Black Swan. She was born enslaved in Mississippi, gained her freedom early in life, moved to Philadelphia, and became a celebrated performer. Cicieretta Jones, known as the Black Patti, in comparison to the Italian singer Adelina Patti, was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and became probably the most famous performer of her day. Both of these singers were lauded for their exceptional voices, and yet they never had the chance to sing full roles in the opera house. That particular stage remained entirely closed to them, despite their stated desire to enter that space. I think more broadly, in the 19th century and beyond, misrepresentations of Blackness remained pervasive on operatic stages. I want to quote here the science fiction writer and cultural critic Samuel Delany, who has written on this subject. From Aida and Otello to Porgy and Bess and Lost in the Stars, we as Blacks have been operaed, have been operated upon, have been operationalized by white composers, so that there seems to be a kind of massive charge running from white musicians to us as Black subjects. All these histories, I think, are important in making sense of the work that African-American artists did in the early 20th century. And I'm particularly interested here in how these artists rewrote opera's existing cultural scripts, remaking them in really creative ways. To think about that, in my book, I think of an idea that I call Black operatic counterculture. I think counterculture might be kind of a counterintuitive word to associate with opera, but I use it here to emphasize that these artists were working in a way that went far beyond a response to the conditions around them. Rather, they were really claiming opera's grand aesthetic resources as creative opportunities for projects of Black world making. Its sonic grandeur, its dramatic maximalism, equipped it to express the complexities of their lives. This was made possible by opera's collaborative nature. Working together in ensembles, these artists created new ways to think about the art form and its possibilities as a sort of public sphere. And this was a politically complex endeavor that could take on a lot of different meanings in the realm of politics. It wasn't necessarily oppositional, it wasn't necessarily assimilationist, and it took on over the years all sorts of different political meanings for the people who participated in it. So I now want to move into thinking about the two kind of case studies that I mentioned at the beginning. We'll start with the singer Antoinette Garnes, who offers what I think is a really beautiful example of what opera could mean to an individual student of the art form. So Garnes was known as the Nightingale of the race. She was born around 1887. She grew up in Detroit, studied at Howard University in DC, and then moved to Chicago, where she attended the Chicago Musical College. And she was one of many young African-American students who sought to learn opera during this early 20th century time period. I learned in my research that for these students, there were abundant opportunities to pursue individualized vocal training. It's something that we can see all over archival documents. Here I have a few pages taken from the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, that include advertisements for vocal instruction and also often piano or string instruments or harmony or other instruments as well. Voice teachers often advertise their availability to offer private lessons to these students for whoever was interested in taking them. And many teachers and singers wrote about a choice they made to work not only on the stage, but also to really invest their time in teaching other artists. A promising tenor named Sidney Woodward wrote once that he decided to stop performing entirely to abandon what he called a career spent along a path brilliant with the light that shines from the footlights of the public singer's life, because instead he wanted to see, quote, hundreds of young women and men pass under his instruction. Teaching really became a priority for a lot of these artists as a way to develop interpersonal networks around opera. There were also singers like Garnes who attended predominantly white conservatories. Herman de Vries, who was a French-trained voice teacher who performed in Paris before moving to the United States and taking up an appointment in Chicago, trained an especially high number of African-American singers. I found his name popping up all over the pages of newspapers that I looked at. And his students were really successful. This woman named Maud Roberts George, was praised as having a well-balanced soprano voice matched by a range of interpretation. Another, Bertha Dickerson Tyree, had a voice of remarkable range, of a quality sweet and thrillingly dramatic with great carrying power. Other singers also traveled to Europe to pursue further training. If you're interested in that subject, there's a wonderful book by a scholar named Kira Thurman called Singing Like Germans that I would strongly recommend. For these singers, attending performances in Europe and taking lessons were key kind of social rituals. The teacher and activist Mary Church Terrell, who became well known for her political work in the civil rights movement, reportedly attended the opera several times a week while she was living in Berlin in the 1890s. And this popularity of vocal training grew out of what's known as the voice culture movement, which is really a sort of cultural phenomenon around the turn of the 20th century. Between the years 1880 and 1920, there were more than 150 manuals written for amateur singers. These were often aimed at producing kind of a standard American voice and creating ideas about what a well-trained voice should sound like. At times, this veered into racialized or racist language, implying that there was a sort of fundamental racial difference that could be seen and heard. The eminent music historian Louis Elson, for example, wrote in 1910, completely groundlessly, that the voices of African-American singers were, this is a quotation, distinguishable from that of the white singer. Thick lips and a flat nose must influence the tone production in a certain degree. And many, though by no means all, of our colored population have these anatomical peculiarities. Clearly a completely unfounded idea, but something that represents ways of thinking about voice and race at the time. And yet, I'm also interested in thinking about how these same ideas about training the voice were reimagined. A lot of Black voice teachers offered really rich and important guidance for amateur singers with a really distinct perspective on this relationship between the body, the voice, and race. For instance, a teacher named Harry A. Williams proclaimed, he who would sing well must first learn the lesson of patience, perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, and self-denial, engaging in indefatigable plodding and struggling to the end that victory may be the reward. I love the kind of drama that he brings to his conception of what studying the voice can do. There's a choral director named Pedro Tinsley, whose book I put up on the slide earlier. His 1912 manual, Tone Placing and Voice Development, promised to demystify the technical side of the vocal art by way of a course in the art of breathing, structure of the vocal apparatus, and hearing the voice. And Tinsley wrote that he really prized voices that sounded technically poised, that sounded effortless, but he placed a real premium on artistic individuality. He wrote, singers of the race may be compared to flowers, meaning that each one had a really unique and individual profile. Readers and students were quite satisfied with his guidance. One of them wrote in a sort of endorsement for the book, "It seems to me that I am getting a new voice." So Antoinette Garnes was part of this world of young Black singers, and she was also someone who was exceptionally gifted. When she graduated from the Chicago Musical College in the year 1919, she was awarded a prize for her skills, and she was given the opportunity to perform the aria Caro Nome from Rigoletto during the commencement exercises. She became later on the only African-American to sing in the chorus of Chicago's Grand Opera Company, which she did for several years. She was known to have 65 different operas in her repertoire, as well as knowledge of Spanish, French, Italian, and German. Her voice was described as exceptional. A critic in the Chicago Defender, the most prominent Black newspaper of the time, wrote that her voice was a cerise voice, warm, highly pathetic, tender, passionless, and that these qualities were engendered by her breath control, melodic flow, and poetic content. And we're very lucky that we can actually hear just a little bit of Garnes's singing. In 1922, she recorded Caro Nome for Black Swan Records, which was the first African-American owned record company, founded just a year before that in 1921. And the record, which you can see here, is quite simple, quite elegant in its visual design. We see the company's logo of the swan in rippling waters. We see the work identified as Grand Opera, and we see the sort of respectable name, Mrs. Antoinette Garnes, identifying the singer. This aria, as I'm sure many people here know, would have been familiar to many listeners. It was and remains a popular showpiece for sopranos, and it figured prominently in the repertoire of an earlier generation of Black concert singers, including Ciceretta Jones. Virtuosic and technically demanding, it offers the opportunity for the singer to showcase her dexterity, vocal control, and ability to portray an emotional metamorphosis. The opera's heroine, Gilda, is a teenage girl who's smitten with her beloved and happily overcome by her emotions. Although she'll later learn that the object of her affections is not who he claims to be, at this particular moment, she's filled with hopeful wonder, even naivete. Perched above a highly embellished vocal line, perched above a shimmering tapestry of woodwinds and muted strings, the singer must first unspool a tricky, highly embellished vocal line with a swan-like ease, conveying her sense of innocence and tranquility. As the aria goes on, its emotional and technical demands intensify, requiring her to access new dimensions of her dramatic palette. Stepwise descending melodies, whose notes are separated by eighth note rests, demand a facade of sustained lyricism, punctuated by a heartbeat-like undercurrent that conveys the physicality of the heroine's romantic awakening. Flights of fancy, rife with challenging skips and leaps, evoke the quickening of her sentiments. We're about to hear Garnes sing this aria, which she takes at a relatively brisk tempo. It's a matter-of-fact and sophistication to a character who's more often portrayed as an utter innocent. She moves really deftly through moments of technical complexity, as if eager to reach these high sustained notes, which she gives ample space to bloom. And in the final cadenza, she displays really beautiful staccato, seeming to sort of revel in her own virtuosity. So let's listen. So to my ears, I hear a really potent convergence of vivacity and dignity in this performance. Both the joyful innocence of Verdi's music and the brilliance of Garnza's technique create a sort of distance from what we might think of as the typical repertoire of Black classically trained singers during this time, namely the spirituals. And these qualities must have accrued some additional significance when Garnes performed this aria in 1919 at a commencement ceremony, but what she may have hoped would be the outset of a long career in opera. If, in the context of a full production, this aria is tinged with anticipation of the tragedies that will later befall its heroine, as a standalone piece, it really brims with uncomplicated potential. It's even possible to imagine Garnes singing this aria not to a lover, but to opera itself as a youthful expression of the hope and possibility that she invested in the genre. Garnes was never able to perform a full operatic role. Yet, even as she, like so many other singers, was denied this opportunity, she repurposed Verdi's music as a means of individualized self-fashioning, a place for her own virtuosity to flourish. I will now move to the second example that I want to share with you today. This is an example of a more collective, excuse me, practice of opera teaching and learning. It's called the Southside School of Grand Opera, founded in Chicago in 1920. This was an era not only of the sort of individual opportunities for operatic singing and training that I mentioned earlier, but also for more collective initiatives. There were many Black choral societies, excuse me, associated often with churches that really proliferated, especially in cities. A singer in Washington, D.C. might join the Amphion Glee Club, the Treble Clef Club, the Washington Permanent Chorus, or the group seen here, the Coleridge Taylor Choral Society. A singer in Chicago might seek out the Choral Study Club or the Umbrian Glee Club, among many others. These groups performed mostly oratorios and other concert repertoire, but they also made occasional forays into opera, providing a sort of training ground for aspiring singers. There were also organizations like the National Association of Negro Musicians, known as NAM, founded in 1919 and pictured here with a group of the officers in 1925. These groups offered really powerful opportunities, not just for performing music, but for learning about it. In the newspaper, in the Chicago Defender, I found this wonderful quotation of a description of one of the opera nights hosted by the Chicago Musical Association, which was an affiliate of that broader national organization. They write that on Monday night, February 2nd, Mrs. Martha Mitchell gave a paper on the origin of opera. Mrs. Mimi Marshall sang an aria from Salome. Mrs. Clara Hutchinson gave the story of Mozart's magic flute. T. Theo Taylor gave excerpts from The Bohemian Girl, and Miss Nanny Strayhorn played the left-hand arrangement of the sextet from Lucia. On February 16th, Mrs. Maudel Wagner and Mrs. Antoinette Garnes, there she is again, read a paper on The Ring and gave the story of de Koven's Rip Van Winkle with vocal illustrations. I love imagining the kinds of communities that might have formed around these kinds of events where like-minded folks could get together to learn about opera in the privacy of these smaller settings and institutions. There were also new institutions that were created. So the Southside School of Grand Opera was founded in 1920 by a man seen here, James Mundy, who was a really storied member of Chicago's Black musical community. Mundy was born in 1886 in Maysville, Kentucky, then moved to Chicago to work as a post office clerk and study at a conservatory. He organized his fellow postal workers into a group that he called the Federal Glee Club in 1910. And from there, he became a really renowned choral director. By 1916, he said that more than 1,000 singers had come within the inspired sway of his baton. And he went on to conduct students in both these group settings and in more individual settings, promoting himself in advertisements as an opera coach. In 1920, he decided to take things a step further, and he announced the opening of the Southside School of Grand Opera. In this announcement, he wrote, "Mr. Mundy believes that there are enough serious-minded male and female singers in Chicago to support a school for the study and performance of grand opera." So the people he sought out for this were all amateur musicians who were just interested in learning something more about the art form. They met weekly on Tuesday nights at the Raymond Public School, and for over a year, these singers studied von Floto's Martha, a hallmark of the 19th century repertory, tells a sort of lighthearted story set in provincial England. There were about 90 students at the first rehearsal, and by January of 1921, there were more than 100. In the newspaper, it was reported that the school became a beehive of musical activity every Tuesday night, and that the technique of opera is taking hold upon the interested students and much improvement is being shown. Mundy also recruited some more experienced soloists to join the group. They gave two sold out performances in December 1921 and were so successful that they went on to offer a third performance at a larger venue in February 1922. I find this example fascinating because it really fostered a sort of intraracial collaboration around opera, and really focused on the question of education. So performance was in some ways almost secondary here. This group rehearsed for more than a year throughout that very cold Chicago winter, spending time together every week to learn this music. They also solicited donations from the community. Tickets for the event were sold at barbershops, at the YMCA, and a preview in the Defender urged average citizens to attend, saying, "Opera is a first-class musical show. Many prominent people plan to be there, and it is expected that you will follow." I wish that I could play you a recording from this performance, but unfortunately that's not possible. It's very difficult, in fact, to capture just what happened on these Tuesday nights as the company rehearsed. Can't really tell us much about the student who scrounged together funding to purchase a score, who trekked to rehearsal every Tuesday night, who practiced her part at home, who squeezed in time to go over the trickiest passages between rehearsals. Mundy was a renowned teacher, and it was reported that he produced admirable teamwork, and their attention to details of absolute correctness in the matter of notes, good attack, and release, combined with interpretation of high order, forecast for their first real opera a real success. And by all accounts, the performance was a real success. We see here a few examples of positive reviews that it received in the newspaper. Interestingly, these comments in these reviews often focused especially on how well trained the chorus was, rather than anything about how good the soloist sounded. They might say something like, the chorus admirably acted their minor parts. They gave ample evidence of the careful training of the members of the company, their intelligent grasp of the thought and material of the opera. I find these comments really interesting because they give us a window into what the real kind of educational priorities of this organization were. Unfortunately, the Southside School of Grand Opera was a short-lived institution. This was its only full production, although many members of the group did continue to appear in programs of excerpts later on. Mundy, the conductor, continued to conduct choirs until he was 90 years old, but he never again staged a full opera. But I still think that this was a really important endeavor for its participants, despite its short lifespan. For example, there was a singer named Hyman Mills who sang a principal role in the opera. He was an insurance clerk born in Mississippi who later became a minister. After he joined this company, he went on to sing in many more church choirs and even organized a choir of his own. In 1915, he officiated a funeral of a woman named Cleo Dickerson, who was the accompanist for the opera company. At Mills's own funeral, which took place in 1961, none other than James Mundy led a choral performance. This web of connections suggests that for those singers who trained their voices at the Southside School of Grand Opera, the experience was anything but temporary, and rather that singing opera became one facet of this really rich public sphere and of their lives in which they formed enduring relationships. So what do these stories tell us ultimately about how African-American teachers and students engaged with opera during the early 20th century? I want to emphasize two main points in closing. One is that Black engagements with opera were remarkably flexible and creative. We see everything from the recording of arias to studying the voice to getting together to learn a piece together. We also see that most of these things are happening outside the opera house and are not so interested in that goal of inclusion. For these artists, they're thinking about opera less as a sort of endpoint for their work and more as an occasion for their own lives in the moment, whether that's an occasion for self-making, an occasion for social gathering, or an occasion for thinking about what the art form means. These activities really show to me how Black artists continue to generate new meaning from opera's collaborative aesthetic characteristics throughout their lives. I mentioned earlier a quotation from Samuel Delany, where he wrote that Black subjects in opera have typically been operaed, operated upon, operationalized. But I think these artists offer an inspiring alternative. As they remade opera's cultural meanings beyond the opera house, they flipped that script to become agents of their own actions and tellers of their own story. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. I'm really eager to answer any questions that you have, and thank you so much again for being here. I think you're muted, Veronica.
Of course, of course. We're going through some technical difficulties over here. I just wanted to say thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. And while people are kind of gathering their thoughts, thinking about any questions they may have, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the questions. I'm also going to drop into the chat some information about websites for the Opera Philadelphia YouTube channel, Price Fest website, Dr. Kaplan's website, and Dr. Kaplan has generously offered a discount code for her new book, Dreaming in Ensemble. You can see the link there in the chat where you can go and buy the book as well as the code. And there's a lovely playlist that accompanies the book as well that is also part of what I've dropped into the chat. So I'm actually going to turn us into into gallery mode. And if anybody would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand, drop it in the chat, or unmute. Go ahead, Lily.
Hi, I can start. Hello, everyone. Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It's great to hear this work in this format. My question is about language, which you're probably not surprised about, which is the caro nome was in English, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm just curious if you found in your work any commentary about whether these singers participating in opera are engaging with opera in foreign languages or just in English. I'm thinking of Marian Anderson being criticized for her pronunciation of German and other things like that. And I'm wondering whether part of the vocal training was the vocal training just kind of vocal technique, or was it also diction and other things that we might associate with opera education today? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lily, for that question. That's a great question. The big picture answer is kind of, it depends, or both. Both were true. Many organizations that were based in the United States and many studies, students of opera focused primarily on opera in English. And this was in many ways kind of typical for the early 20th century, when there were a whole bunch of kind of traveling opera companies that would travel around performing all sorts of operas in English. So that wasn't necessarily unusual. There was a company I didn't get to talk about today called the Theodore Drury Grand Opera Company, founded in New York in 1900, which was an all-Black opera company, and they performed only in English. That was kind of one of the ways that they sought to make their performances accessible to a broader audience. However, individual singers, and especially those ones who went to go study in Europe, often learned other languages as part of that training. There's a singer named Katerina Yarborough who in 1933 becomes the first African-American woman to sing the role of Aida with a company in the United States, not the MAP, but a smaller company. And it's a company who has an Italian director, and she'd studied in Italy and become fluent in Italian. And reportedly part of why he hired her is because her Italian was so good that he knew she would be perfect for the part in that role that was performed in Italian. She reportedly loved Italian so much that she taught her dog to speak only in Italian. So she would say sit, stay in Italian too, the dog, kind of a fun fact. So I think, it was maybe in ways kind of similar to how it can work today. There were opportunities for singers who really wanted to focus on the English language to do that. But there were also some singers, especially those who pursued training in Europe, to learn other languages.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the answer. I have to say that I was really inspired by listening to your lecture to learn more about some of the, we won't call them lost, we'll call them hidden voices of the operatic space. My mother is a history person and has often talked about some of the people that you spoke about today. And so I know that Black people have had a long history and a long have been a part of the operatic space, but it's something that I don't think people who even are like the operaphiles of our spaces know that, and I really, really appreciate it. And one of them is actually buried in Eden Cemetery in Philadelphia, so we're all tied together. There actually is a question in the chat. Someone is asking about the Hackley collection in Detroit and wondering if you did any research in that space.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I did do research in that collection. It's an amazing collection located at the Detroit Public Library. I spent about a week there a few years ago, combing through those archives and working with the really wonderful archivist there who helped me dig through many, many, many boxes of materials. I also actually, in the last chapter of the book, write a little bit about the founding of that collection. Hackley herself began her career as an opera singer before moving into vocal training of various kinds. And there was a collection established in her honor in 1941, which was not only kind of the first collection of materials related to African-American opera, but related to a special collection related to African-American music. In particular, it was the first one that was founded in the US. So it's a really cool collection for that reason. In the book, I have a great picture of a singer named Carlotta Franzel in a record store looking for records that she wants to add to that collection. So thank you for shouting out that place. It's a really wonderful resource for doing this kind of research.
Yeah, we have one more question that I can find in the chat, and maybe as they start to come in, I'll pop in and say some more, ask some more. People are wondering, were there any African-American opera singers who went to Paris in the 1920s who had careers as singers in European opera houses?
Yeah, it's another great question. There were a few singers who went to Europe and pursued careers, more often in Italy than in Paris, although some of them did move through Paris as well. One is a woman named Florence Cole Talbert, who was another singer of this era, who was born in the US, also Detroit, lived in California, and then ended up moving to Italy, where she actually became the first Black woman to sing the role of Aida with a European company there in the 1920s. Yarborough, that singer I mentioned in response to Lily's question, also spent a lot of time in Europe, again, studying mostly in Italy, but also performing elsewhere. And of course, by the time we get to the 1950s and later, there's a whole kind of generation of Black singers who are traveling to Europe and pursuing careers there. For these women in the 20s and 30s, they were fewer and far between, but they were also part of this broader movement of African-American artists and writers, people like Langston Hughes or Josephine Baker, who pursued careers in Europe during this time. So they had an opportunity to be part of these kind of broader cultural networks in their work. In the book, I chose to focus mostly on people in the US just because you have to make choices somewhere. But it's a really fascinating story to think about those singers who pursued careers in Europe as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And this person said, you have mentioned this, but who was the teacher? You may have mentioned this, but who was the teacher of Antoinette Garnes?
Sure, thank you. So I can give kind of a partial answer to that. I assume that she had excellent voice teachers as a child and during her time at Howard University in DC. I don't know the names of those people, unfortunately. I do know that when she moved to Chicago, she was one of the students of Herman DeVries, the teacher I mentioned earlier, who taught a whole bunch of African-American students. So he was certainly one of the teachers who she studied with, but I'm sure there are many more kind of unnamed people who helped shape her musical life.
Great. Maybe we can have one more. We have somebody, this will be our final question, we'll say. At this time in the opera world, was blackface used or not for characters such as Aida?
Yes. Blackface was used very often, almost all the time, for characters such as Aida. And this was a subject of much criticism in Black newspapers by critics who were writing about opera. There were many critics who found this practice incredibly frustrating and insulting, and talked often about that, especially because actual Black singers were barred from operatic stages. And they would often kind of point out the hypocrisy of that practice. When someone like Florence Cole Talbot or Katerina Yarborough performs, often the commentary says things like, she didn't even need any makeup, or she was just able to perform in her own skin, in a way that both kind of critiques that practice and highlights a sort of natural relationship between these performers and those characters. Now, of course, these singers were seeking to perform many roles other than Aida. They didn't want to be stuck in that one particular role, but it was often part of how they thought about their qualifications more broadly for opera and to be on operatic stages.
Thank you. I will say that I have learned quite a bit from this lecture, and I really appreciate your time and your scholarship in this area. I thank everyone for coming to this lecture today. We really appreciate you coming and learning with us. I'm going to drop into the chat again before we end some of the information that was dropped in previously around Dr. Kaplan's book and the code for any sort of for the discount that is a part of it, as well as the playlist that is accompanies the book. And I want to thank Dr. Cass, Dr. Lily Cass, who dropped into the chat one of the books that Dr. Kaplan mentioned. It is also in the chat. So if you're interested in any of the things that were mentioned in this space, please feel free to grab them now so that you can take them along on your way. And thank you again, Dr. Kaplan.
Thank you so much for having me.